What's up, Jake Paulers? It's your boy, Logan Paul, back with another writing review. Anyway, hi everyone. Glad to be back on the second channel. Welcome back. Today, we've got Fanfiction, which I think is a first for this channel, if I'm not mistaken, which is awesome, because I think fanfiction is kind of discredited a lot of the times, kind of underrated in a way. And you see memes a lot where it's like, it's crazy reading the hardest line you've ever read and knowing you can't share it with anyone because it comes from a fan fiction. And it's, yeah, that's kind of true. So yeah, it's kind of neat to be taking a look at fan fiction. So this is Final Fantasy 14 fan fiction written by Maria. So thank you, Maria, for the submission. Maria is one of my patrons, and so I want to thank them for their support immensely. Before we get into it, there are some content warnings and a note here from the author. So, content warnings include brief discussion of past fictional disasters, including forest fires and loss of family, light medical talk, mention of blood, i.e. a paper cut, and monumental pretentiousness. Love it. I recently got back from a little writing workshop, and one of the readers there gave a content warning for too many adverbs, which I thought was great. And this is just in that same vein, monumental pretentiousness. I'll be the judge of that. Anyway, we also have a note from the author here that says, this is a Final Fantasy XIV fanfiction taking place after its Endwalker story arc. This also means that it indirectly mentions some plot beats from that, but I don't honestly think it's quite spoiler territory for those who would want to play it. For those who would/haven't, I've included a few footnotes with just the bare minimum information to make sense of what's going on here. But otherwise, this story is domestic and self-contained enough that its emotional core and the relationship it centers around should be understandable without knowing anything about the game. I am so sorry. I don't know why they wrote that, but okay, I am so sorry. I've been writing all my life, but until recently it was entirely self-taught, with all the bad habits that breeds. It's only recently that I've been working on exercising those habits. As part of this, I read John Gardner's On Becoming a Novelist at your recommendation, and it was a tremendous help, so thank you for that. You're welcome, Maria. I agree. On Becoming a Novelist is a big help, I think. Also, I think I would describe pretty much all writers as self-taught. Sure, a lot of writers eventually take certain classes on writing, but I think everybody gets into writing just on their own at first, right? At least I would say so. I don't know. I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with being self-taught, and I think that's how we all start. But anyway, I think we can get into it. Just one last note from me. As always, I want to read this. Keep in mind, I'm not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep writing. And for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. So, I think there's one last thing I should mention. I don't know anything about Final Fantasy, really. Um, in fact, before recording, I was confusing it with Kingdom Hearts, so that should tell you really how little I know about this whole thing. Yeah. I apologize for that in advance, but I think I should hopefully still have some worthwhile things to say about this just on the writing level. But like I said, keep in mind that this is all just my opinion anyway. So anyhow, let's finally get into the text. We'll spend maybe about 40 minutes reading through this. Maria sent, I think, like 28 pages, which admirable, by the way. Writing 28 pages of anything is not easy. But yeah, we'll just get through as much as we can in about 40-ish minutes. So 1. Survivor. The door swung shut, and quiet came to the clinic once more. Outside could be heard faint conversation of passers-by on the street below, and titchy rounds of the coursers perched above. Okay, so let's pause right there just for a quick second. I'm always interested in first lines. The door swung shut. Oops. The door swung shut and quiet came to the clinic once more. As a first line, personally, I think maybe you can substitute something else, something a little more gripping, something more it doesn't necessarily have to be action-oriented, but just something that makes the reader need to keep reading, right? It's like they tell you in high school when you're writing your essays. You really do wanna open with a hook, right? You want your reader to keep reading. So, the door swung shut and quiet came to the clinic once more. There is some intrigue there, right? Like, what is the clinic? Um, who swung the door shut? Is somebody leaving or are they just arriving, right? So there is some intrigue there, but I think it can be even more engaging, personally. As for the second sentence, outside could be heard faint conversations of passers-by on the street below, and titchy rounds of the coursers perched above. Titchy's a great word, that really caught my eye. Um, I'm not actually sure what coursers means. I don't know if that's something specific to Final Fantasy or if that's just my general lack of knowledge rearing its head again, but in any case, it's fine as a second sentence. It's an establishing sentence, right? Which I think is valuable. I think in a novel it's good to always establish your setting, right? But like I said, I think the most important thing first is to make sure that the reader is hooked, and then you can go into the work of setting and character and everything else. So, speaking of character, Yasmin breathed in deep through her nose, and after assuring herself she wouldn't be heard, let out a good long sigh. Okay, I like that. I'm sorry to be pausing so much here. But I guess that's why you sent this, right, Maria? I just want to highlight that I like that. I especially like this selection of detail. And after assuring herself she wouldn't be heard, let out a good long sigh. After assuring herself she wouldn't be heard. So that tells me that Yasmin is probably self-conscious, right? Either that or, maybe has just been through a lot and really doesn't want to be noticed, doesn't want to be observed, perceived at all in this moment, right? So that's maybe that's your hook, right? Because then the reader can ask, who is Yasmin? Why do they not want to be observed? And why are they sighing, right? Yeah, personally, I think maybe that's a better first sentence than the first sentence that we currently have. But again, just one man's opinion. When her eyes fluttered open again, they scanned lackadaisically to the open window, a trio of potted daisies waving in the breeze to her as if to beckon her over to look outside. She smiled thinly at them, as if to tell them she was sorry, but she couldn't just now. And then she rose to her feet to wash her hands and write a report of the patient's visit. So, sorry, excuse me. So it sounds like Yasmin is a doctor or a medical professional, and the reason the door swung shut was the patient just left. So, a lot of intrigue in this first paragraph. I'm certainly intrigued. Um, yeah, I like I said, I do think the hook can be more hooky, but otherwise, I think this is working okay. One thing I also wanted to note was just be cautious about adverbs and about gerunds. It can be very easy to overuse those things. I think lackadaisically is a fine adverb in this instance because it's not repeating what we already know. That's what happens a lot with adverbs, right? Is that they're too redundant. Like, screamed loudly, right? You don't need loudly there because the word screamed already implies loudness, right? And then gerunds, like I said, you just, like with adverbs, you just have to be careful not to overuse them because a verb's real power is in its verbness, right? Verbs are the actual action of any sentence, and ultimately we read a book for the action, right? For the things that happen, those verbs, right? When you get right down to it. And turning a verb into a gerund runs the risk of kind of taking away its power, right? So again, it's just something you have to be careful about. But with that, we're through the first paragraph, and um, personally, I would say don't put these big spaces between paragraphs because usually those spaces denote a time jump, and maybe there is a time jump between all these paragraphs, but somehow I doubt it. So yeah, I would keep those paragraphs just connected. The indent is enough to let us know that you're starting a new paragraph, right? Again, call that personal preference, but I do think that's kind of industry standard too. Anyway, on to our next paragraph. In the few months which had followed the final days, the people of Radzathan had been working tirelessly at restoration, to restore the livelihoods dashed, to restore the homes burned, and not least of all, to restore the cheer and magnanimity that seemed to characterize the great city-state. Oh, excuse me, magnanimity, sorry. The news of the true satrap, the worm behind the curtain, was received with welcome and open arms befitting his homeland, then, by an absence of adrenaline, giving way to some re-examination, and then finally, the growing unease settled back into appreciation. Okay, I'd better read the footnote before we go on. Radzatan is a city-state on the near eastern island of Thavnair, taking cultural cues from India and Southeast Asia. Okay. Um, there's still some context here that I am uh, simply lost on, like satrap. Um, I guess just that more than anything, right? Um, yeah, we'll keep reading, and hopefully I'll get the gist. I'll say, for me especially, the beginning of any story is always kind of the hardest part, where it's like because for one thing, the story is trying to convince me to read it, right? But then it's also like kind of out of necessity, you have to put a lot of exposition at the top, right? Maybe not right at the top, because ideally you want to start with some action to do some hooking, right? But there's inevitably gonna be, exposition. It's the start of the hero's journey, right? And and it's kind of hard taking in a lot of information all at once. So, like I said, for that reason, beginnings are hard for me because it's like, you know, a lot of information up front, and sometimes I don't catch all of it. Anyway, with that in mind, let's keep going. That all these millennia, an entire line of succession had been vassals to a figure not remotely known to his people, was nothing short of unsettling to the people at first. To many, this simple fact was a far greater worry than his being a dragon, but his vassal's actions over the millennia had proven over these past months to be consistent with his own. It came into stark relief that though his visage was a thing of brutal nightmares, his heart was every bit as full of radiant dreams, all the more pleasant for their attainability. Okay. So it sounds like we had this dragon named Satrap, right? A worm, Wyrm. And Satrap, like nobody realized that Satrap was a dragon. Um, but then once people found out, it turned out not to be a super big deal anyway. And the vassals were acting consistently with the dragon, and that was a good thing, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm not a Final Fantasy person, otherwise a lot of this would probably click a lot easier for me. And this is primarily for Final Fantasy readers, right? That's kind of the thing with fan fiction is that, like, you're writing for an audience who presumably already knows the source material that you're going off of. So I'm not exactly the right reader for this. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we keep going. But just a couple other things I want to point out about the writing is that there are some instances that sound like, well, not even entirely, but just a little bit on paper, a little bit like AI. And I don't mean that in the derogatory way where people are like, oh, that movie was so bad, it seems like it was written by AI. Because that's not what I mean. I just mean that there are some ticks here that AI shares. For example, the M dash. AI loves to use that, which is a bummer because I also love to use the M dash. So if you want to, be really careful about making sure your writing's not perceived as AI, then maybe you want to use those M dashes more sparingly. And there was another example. Let's see. It was one of those sentences that starts with the word though, like, although this, then this, right? Which AI also loves to do. So again, I'm not saying the quality of writing is poor here because I don't think it is. I'm just saying these days, unfortunately, we have to be really careful that we're not even accidentally mimicking the way AI writes because most readers do, I think, want to avoid reading AI-generated material, right? So, again, something to keep in mind. Um, but I don't actually have a problem with how things have been written so far. Yeah, I'll emphasize that. So, where were we? It came into stark relief that though his visage was a thing of brutal nightmares, his heart was every bit as full of radiant dreams. Oh, there it was. Though his visage was a thing of brutal nightmares, his heart was every bit as full as radiant dreams. And it's tough because there's not really a way to streamline that. I mean, I guess there's always another way to write a sentence, right? But that's a pretty simple way to put it, and so it's a bummer that AI loves to mimic that, and frankly, that's causal, right? AI mimics that because it's so easy to mimic. But like I said, it's not bad. In fact, it would be hard to rewrite in simpler terms. Anyway, all the more pleasant for their attainability. It had not taken him very long to prove that he was a benevolent leader, and that the Thavnair, the people wait, and that the Thavnair, the people loved, had not been lost with good Ahowan. Ahowan. I think you need a couple of commas after Thavnair, and that the Thavnair, comma, the people loved, comma, had not been lost with good Ahowan. I assume that's what is intended there, but I can't say for sure. One political satirist, lampooned for his utterly tactless timing, made the observation in a daily rag that the dread face and towering span of a worm of the first brood was little different from the average Auri gent anyhow. All right, let's check the footnote there. Aura, adjectival auri, are a race of humans with horns in place of ears, tails, and patches of scales scattered across their body. They often have faintly glowing eyes. The men are exceptionally tall with angular faces. The women, such as Yasmin, not so much. Okay. Good to know that Yasmin is an auri or an aura. Yeah. To lend him some small credit, Yasmin, unmoored as she too was by the news, felt a greater comfort and credibility in the glow of his praise and gratitude than she had most men. He loved the good children of Thavnair all, all to a man, and as he had, it turned out, even a few months on, folk could still be heard reeling over the revelation, borne Thavnair up and into its place as fairly the center of commerce on the five seas, so too had he borne them from great and fantastic loss. Okay, that is a really long sentence, and it's okay to have long sentences, but they do need to be clear, and again, let's keep in mind that I am not up on all of this diction and lore, like Thavnair and the Five Seas. Those don't do anything for me in terms of knowledge. I don't know what those things are. That being said, I think you could probably divide this sentence into at least two other sentences, and it would be a little clearer. And I do that all the time, right? Like a lot of what I'm reading here is really reminding me of my own writing because, yeah, it's like really easy as the writer to just end up with a long sentence because you know what you're saying and you know how clear you're being, but on paper it just doesn't always come off that way, right? So, yeah, that's just something to look for when going through and editing, right? To look for those sentences that need to be broken up and made simpler. By his guidance, the support of nations such as Charlayan, the advices and examples of the now disbanded scions of the Seventh Dawn, and finally, and mostly, their own shared inner strength, the people of Thavnair had all but come to terms. Okay, footnote 3 for Seventh Dawn, the faction of Final Fantasy XIV's main protagonists. Okay. They had accepted their need to cry for a time, to grieve for all that had been lost, and then accepted too the duty of putting aright all that could be so. Where absences had appeared, in time and with some settling, their places would be filled. Filled far from perfectly, but better than not at all. Businesses that had lost ranks made a place in desperation for those who had been to the workforce little more than hopeless hopefuls before. Families who had lost people, or sadder still, the other way round, took comfort in their community now more than ever, and the comfort was warm more often than cold. There had even been grim sorts of silver linings, once again viewed perhaps with more pessimism in the political rags. Okay, I just want to pause here to say that this is a good status quo to open a story on, right? There has recently been a disaster, and that's brought people closer together, and things can only get worse from there, right? Because we assume that that's where this story is going. We assume that something is going to disquiet the new status quo. This is what I wish the Star Wars sequels had done. I wish they had started with, rebuilding post episode 6, and then something happens to disrupt that rebuilding, right? Instead, J.J. Abrams made the choice to just open on a completely fine status quo, and then a new empire comes in and uh, disrupts things, right? Or like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, right? Sorry, these are nerdy TV movie references instead of literary references, but Falcon and the Winter Soldier opens, post Thanos, where people are trying to rebuild after the snap, and then the post snap happened, and now everybody's back on the planet, and the planet has to account for that again, right? So it's a good status quo to open on, right? It's like things are starting to chill, but there's still shaky ground, and so it's ripe for contention or for villains to rise up, right? So anyway, that was kind of a long tangent, all to say that this is a good place to open. So one such upside had been that the Cazal Foundation, an initiative to put to charitable use an apparently hearty sum of wealth saved by the satrap. Oh wait. Oh, I see. Sorry, I kind of misread that sentence, but I get the picture now. Together with his cabinet and two of the Don's erstwhile scions, the first order of the initiative had been to construct a proper orphanage for those children most unfortunate in the wake of the days. Yasmin, though their coffers were certain and hers not, failed to stop herself from donating a hefty sum to the foundation, and so again came the guttural gratitude. In this donation and in the precarity she willingly courted by overstretching her purse strings for it, Yasmin was not unique among her peers. Indeed, in ironic fashion for such a mercantile nation, charity was the name of the game these days. Did you so much as stumble, you could be certain that you would look up to see an outstretched hand, and almost certain that that hand was proffered benevolently. The kindness and generosity of strangers, especially those strangers hardly more fortunate than oneself, rarely fails to inspire another stranger still. So it sounds like the narrator is kind of like generalizing there, or coming to a reflection based on their observations, right? Which is fine, but just the switch to present tense kind of threw me off for a second. Um, Still, that's fine. It's okay for the narrator to reflect, pontificate from time to time. In fact, that's a key component of prose, right? Is reflection. So yeah. Anyhow, like I said, the present tense just kind of threw me for a second. Anyway. One is either shown quite truly the power of a kind gesture to elevate or even save another life, not unlike one's own, often at less cost than initially presumed, or one is entirely unsentimental, but is given little choice to go with the flow, rather than have one's reputation suffer for boorish behavior. In times such as these, no small few would argue that it comes to the same thing in all practical terms. I like that. Poignant, first of all. Yeah, it would be nice if all of us extended a little more kindness to one another at about this time, wouldn't it? Also, though, um, I would like a little bit more showing, right? I think this reflection is fine. I do like it, but show me more how the people are being kind to each other, right? I do like the example of, if you fall, then there will be an outstretched hand to help you up. But yeah, show me a little bit more than that. It's nice that there's a charity. It's nice that they're building an orphanage, but I think you can go even deeper, right? What are the person to person interactions that are happening these days that really show just how kind everyone is being to each other? And nor, in the loss the Thavnarian people had suffered, and the fight they faced before them in its wake, was Yasmin altogether unique, and it was this understanding with which she lived. So again, I would say that sentence is a little bit long and a little bit hard to follow. Again, kind of just one man's opinion. I also think it's weird that it starts with and nor, which are two conjunctions, right? Just one after the other. And I don't really like I don't really understand why either one is there, to be honest. I think it could just start with the word in. You can call that nitpicking though. Oh, and the next sentence also starts with nor either, which also kind of feels like two conjunctions. So I don't know. I maybe the author's doing that on purpose, and I'm kind of missing the point of it. But I think we could streamline those, or if not, just outright delete both of those. But anyway, nor either, in all due fairness, was she remotely exempt. Those who lived in Radzat-Han, when Svarbanu's foul wings bore it into the fire and firmament, could at least be comforted with the reminder that it at least, okay, he used at least twice in a row in that sentence, but that's okay, just delete one and we'll call it good. At least there was a Radzat-Han, pithy and unkind comfort as it was. The same could not be said after the great and seemingly indomitable blaze that had consumed the palm boughs to the north with such fervor that the clouds of smoke billowing across the island continued to do so for weeks, all in a fitful stream not unlike the shuddering gasps of a nearly fatal fever for Vanaspati. That is to say, the same could not be said for settlements such as Sramanasalv or the conclaves of Manusayan and Murgon, votaries now either raised or buried by the collapsed and moldering forests, for the everyday lives of the people who lived there now forever changed, and for far too many of the people that lived them. A correction is in order to parry the political pedant, and to nod in solemn solidarity with the furtively optimistic, both of whom would say the same. Vanaspati, the land itself, still remains. So first, let me compliment that sentence for the alliteration. That was really neat. In order to parry the political pedant and to nod in solemn solidarity with the furtively optimistic. Those almost sound like Broadway lyrics with just the, I guess you could call it the wordplay going on, right? Or just the organization of words there and the word choices. I like it. It's fun. It was fun to read. I do also want to say more broadly, um, kind of like I said with, the observation about the kindness going on here and, how that's good for all societies. And I said earlier that, the beginnings of stories are hard because there has to be a lot of introduction. I do wish there were more showing here. I think you could cushion all of this exposition between scenes, right? Between happenings, like what's Yasmin doing right now? And how could this exposition relate to everything that she is seeing and everything that she is doing, right? That way it would feel a little bit less like exposition, right? It has to be exposition no matter what. You just have to have that, right? But it can feel a little bit less like it if we get this information in between action, right? So I hope that makes sense. Hmm. But Yasmin could only derive a general sort of hope from this. The comfort wasn't cold exactly, like the chef's finest plate of dish intended for another table. She appreciated its form and aroma, and was honestly happy for the sumptuous feast awaiting whoever had actually ordered it. Meanwhile, hers was still on its way, and she could but take comfort in the work she had put into ensuring that it was. She would hold that her loss was comparatively quite merciful. She had only lost her current every day, as it was at the time of the disaster. She was a transplant to Vanaspati from Radzat-Han, working as the apprentice of a more apt example of tragic loss. The edifice of his clinic was, of course, now ash mixed with identical ash, so that where it had once stood was now difficult to picture by returning to the site, let alone unapparent to any first seeing it now. But his apprentice, his nurse, and his will had survived. Will here meaning ideal rather than testament, but oh, but as the man had nothing but his profession, and as there was not a soul in the world who knew him and doubted what he would have wished, it was a distinction without a difference. Yasmin succeeded him at the clinic's head as the clinic's head physician, and whilst others were still mourning the losses of family businesses to the losses of their proprietors, she unknowingly but without hesitation seized upon one such loss and rebuilt. Had she been about any other business, or even if she conducted her business as a physician for a fee, she might have been seen as cutthroat. Certainly, she had whiled away sleepless nights, calling herself exactly that, and harsher. But the community she newly served, and the patients she had vowed to do right by, despite the complete upheaval of their lives, in different geographical directions no less, couldn't see her as anything but unimaginably charitable. Her family, too, viewed her as a point of truly great pride, at least socially speaking. At but 32 summers of age, she was now the proud head of of Y. Jalali General Health Clinic, personally and handsomely endorsed by a foreign benefactor in the interest of charity. Yasmin was not a bore, and so she did not combat these allegations, but she felt it was no less than her responsibility, and that besides, she had only positioned herself to live up to it. She had not yet done so. Okay, one quick thing. I see the word bore here, and I noticed earlier that the author used the word boorish, and readers are going to notice that too. So I think you could replace bore with a synonym, or boorish with a synonym. There are lots of synonyms for those two words. But I also wanted to say that I kind of like the characterization that we're getting for Yasmin here. I'm starting to see that Yasmin is kind of cynical, it seems, like at the very least kind of closed off, kind of reserved, or kind of determined, right? She's not going to let things stand in her way, um, and maybe even to her own detriment, right? Um, it seems like she wants to just keep moving forward, right? Even if maybe that's too brash of her, right? But at the same time, just like the author tells us, right, Yasmin was not a bore. So she might be rash in some respects, but she's not sloppy, right? So I hope I summarized her characterization well enough because I'm feeling it. I am. I like what we're shown here from her. Doctors are paragons and leaders in the care of others, yet, as the best of them will admit, miserable examples of care for oneself. See, that's funny because I actually have heard that before from real doctors, right? Isn't there like a saying that uh, the worst people to take doctors' advice are doctors, right? Something like that. Anyway. Thus had the dear old Arcasodora, Arc, hang on, Arcasodara, dear old Arcasodara Sanvi found herself with the un, uninviable task of the very same reconstruction of the clinic as Yasmin, the very same reconnection with and remuneration for the previous patients, as well as review of the next as her. And vexingly, the very same battle to urge Yasmin to give herself forgiveness and affection that she had so long fought with her predecessor. Let's take a look at that footnote real quick. Arcasodara are a race of anthropomorphic elephants. References to Sanvi's size and weight aren't meant to reflect on her the way they would a human. Arcasodara are all massively tall, wide, and heavy. Cool. Though Sanvi was a more than willing caretaker of the sick, having had her children and her grandchildren, she was quite tired now of taking care of those who were, with the sole exception of self-indulgent fatigue, perfectly healthy. And though the exasperation had begun to wax again after the past months of vulnerability, sympathy, and, frankly, like behavior, her diligence did not wane, nor did her kindness, and certainly not her love. The throat with which Sanvi voiced her affections had grown tired and hoarse, and she now spoke through it sparingly, but it was observed by more than one onlooker that Sanvi was fortunate and could lean upon a number of other talents and find quite respectable work elsewhere, to say nothing of a comfortable retirement. If that was what she wanted, if that was what she wanted. Her family was quick to observe that if Yasmin felt Sanvi was out of line, her face would have betrayed some sign. Instead, they greeted each other every morning with, if not a smile, then a shared groan of exhaustion. It was while rumming on this, her love for the old dear, that she found herself strolling across, and then with a pursed smile, as if shyly flirting with absent-mindedness out of the clinic. The clinic as it stood now seemed a great improvement over the wide wooden hut that had served them so dutifully in Vanaspati. It bore a strong and vivid face and fit in perfectly with the businesses in the district of Dharma. But that was part of the problem. Previously, the venue, an office space on the second floor of a larger building shared with other offices, had been one of bookkeeping and coin counting, and it had been built with these things in mind. Storerooms, which could hold a great lot of records, had the luxury of being built far more compact than convalescent rooms. The desperation, ingenuity, and coin with which Yasmin had synthesized a stuffy but respectable medical clinic out of these unlikely surrounds called into question whether she was, as she claimed, not much of an alchemist. Yasmin had been grateful for her proximity to a proper hospital so that emergencies in the immediate vicinity were less likely to fill her 2 vacant beds. Across from the convalescent room was her archive and office, such as it was for private consultation and examination. Built as it was with archivery in mind, it was a comfortable hiding spot for papers tucked neatly away from the sun and the rain outside. But this very same accommodation was, to a patient alone with Yasmin, at times a great discomfort. To patients and often to herself, too, given that her practice was open to any sex or gender. Local clinician seeks bodyguard was a headline which baffled some readers until the person sat next to them described the eponymous clinician's digs. This was not actually the reason for the headline, but there were those, especially women, to whom it was a good reason, as good a reason as any. The front office had looked quite spacious at first glance. That day she came to claim the lot. It looked so as it had lacked furniture, a state in which any broom closet might look like a reasonable studio at first glance, and as Yasmin was an houri lass. She was actually fairly tall among her ilk, but her ilk were of notorious compactness, bested only by the lalafel. Sanvi's enormous physique found difficulty with the door alone. Then, when the labor of furnishing the office was done, Sanvi was eventually comfortable. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause here to kind of reiterate a point I made earlier, just that, again, this is kind of a lot of exposition, and it would be nice to couch some of this between some action, right? We could see Yasmin with a patient, right? And that would give us some of the information that's already here, and in a more streamlined and character-driven way, right? We could actually see Yasmin interacting with someone, and that would be awesome. Yeah, basically just that. Um, yeah, I just feel like it's kind of been a while since we've, you know, actually had any action. Um, so yeah, you could just sneak some in there, and at the same time, you can be sneaking exposition in there. So, with that in mind, we'll keep forward for another 5 minutes or so. She never did quite look it, nestled behind her desk in a way that looked like it was devised as a stress test of the giant yet precise Arcasidaran hand. Then, like bad comedy one didn't have the heart to make up, they took a Rothgar gentleman as their guard. If the walls had eyes, they would each morning be subjected to the farcical image of a quite tiny, persnickety lady striding in with grace in her purpose, followed closely by an elephantine woman towering in both width and height, and a near equally sized feline fistfighter. He had been observant enough to see that a joke could easily have been told about the spectacle, but lacked the cleverness to ever tell it. One more thing that I was thinking. Am I gonna remember? It may have just slipped my mind, actually. Uh, oh, right. I was just thinking, like, you know, Yasmin feels like she needs protection, right? An on-site bodyguard, which, fair enough. But it seemed like things were good, right? And so that feels contradictory just a little bit to where, everyone's being really kind to each other, and that on the whole is making the society really peaceful during the time of Reconstruction, right? And so I think maybe during that summary, it would be useful to point out that there are bad actors who are acting, I don't know, under the veil of night or whatever, doing nefarious things secretly so as not to disrupt the general sentiment of kindness or, their standing in the eyes of the rest of society, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, just that. And, it's possible for more than one thing to exist at once, obviously. It's possible for a society to seem really well-oiled, but, have problems under the surface. But, yeah, just the way that we've been told everything so far, uh, finding out that Yasmin felt unsafe just felt a little bit dissonant. That's all. All this being as it was, Yasmin valued opportunities to step out into the sun and the fresh air. The clinic was perfectly well ventilated as a matter of necessity, and though small for a clinic, it was not actually a suffocatingly cramped space. But Yasmin often found it felt stuffy regardless. Perhaps it was the shut doors which limited the airflow. Perhaps it was the long hours which gave her achingly intimate familiarity with its confines. Perhaps it was entirely mental and might have been no different were she working out of the wide open cella of Devatagara. As if to forcefully jettison the thought, she let out a long deep sigh through her nose, sitting atop the sturdy edge of a planter, high enough that she could lazily kick her feet. It felt If she felt so at ease, her thoughts turned to her dear old friend. Occasionally she would lift her sagging head, and her lips and cheeks would prime themselves to form a greeting smile, but would see no sign of her and relax again. It was only she, and those who knew her, who could have told that she was fatigued, and those who could would have been pleased to see her at rest for a change. Holding a smile close behind her face, waiting to put it to use, had evidently put a real one, if faint, beneath her dozy amber eyes. Okay. I think maybe we'll stop there. We got through about 6 pages, it looks like. Um, I'm definitely curious about a lot of this. And it looks like this break is slightly larger than the previous paragraph breaks, so this might be a jump in time. But anyway. Yeah, I don't know anything about Final Fantasy, but even so, I am curious about a lot of things. I'm definitely curious about the world, but more than anything, I'm curious about Yasmin, and especially with this like last tidbit where it's like apparently Yasmin has an old friend, a dear old friend who she lost, right? I want to know more about that, and in fact, maybe it would be good if that information came a little earlier, right? And maybe Final Fantasy fans would know that already. I don't know. I really know nothing about this franchise, I'm sorry, except for, all the bits that are in Smash Brothers, I guess, but anyway, like I said, there's a lot of intrigue here. There's a lot of good stuff here, right? It's a good setting. So far, I'm very interested in Yasmin as a character, and frankly, I would like to know more about her, right? I'm definitely curious about the journey that she's about to go on. Um, yeah, there are a lot of great choices made here. As far as general advice goes, like, if I were to summarize what I think, could change here, I'd think, on the whole, the sentences just need to be simpler. There are just a lot of really long sentences here that I found myself having a hard time keeping track of. I think that's kind of the main thing, and, maybe you're not so interested in editing this, maybe it's already up on some fan fiction forum, which is awesome. But just for future projects, right? If you're interested in kind of, you know, I don't know, changing your style, I guess. And keep in mind this is all based on my opinion, of course. But if you are interested, I would try and streamline these sentences. I know it's somewhat common in fan fiction circles to not really edit the work, but to just kind of give it a once over, or not even that, just to write it and then post it. And, a lot of people will be happy with that. And I'm not saying that's what happened here. This honestly does look pretty clean. I only noticed like a couple of errors and they didn't even seem really worth pointing out. Um, but yeah, if you're interested in editing your work, that's something that you could look at. First of all, is how can I make these sentences as easy to follow as possible, right? So that would be my main piece of advice. Otherwise, just the point that I mentioned a couple times about how to effectively do exposition, how to effectively do that first step of the hero's journey. For me, it's about character, it's about scene, right? It's about visualizing and seeing for ourselves the main character or whichever character you want to introduce first. It's about seeing them in their habitat and then getting a feel for that habitat ourselves And then the narrator can come in and be like, this is widely what you need to know about this habitat and about this character, etc., etc. So those would be my two main pieces of advice for this piece specifically. But Maria, I do think you've got a good thing going here. I would imagine Final Fantasy fans would be interested in this. I really don't know for sure. uh, but like I said, I like Yasmin a lot. I think the characterization of her is done pretty well. I can see that she has flaws, which is also a really great way to do the exposition, do the first step of the hero's journey while keeping things interesting, is you introduce your character and you introduce their flaws right away, right? So I can already get a sense of the journey that Yasmin is about to go on, and that intrigues me. That makes me want to keep going, right? So, like I said, good thing going here. Keep it up. Keep writing in general. Uh, it's nice to, like, already have an audience when you start writing, presumably, right? That's another good thing about fan fiction is that you're writing for a specific audience, and the odds are good that you will get some eyes on it for that reason, right? At least that's my thinking. I could be totally wrong about that. But anyhow, I think we'll leave things there. Maria, thank you again for submitting this. Uh, like I said, just keep writing. Thanks a bunch for the support. Thanks everyone for watching, and ultimately keep in mind this is a rough draft.